Wow. I haven't done anything yet. Wow, I've never come on stage and had applause instantly. That's very kind of you all. I hope that sets the tone. Well, I know that will set the tone for the rest of this evening. Welcome, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon. My name is David Saunders. I'm an associate curator here at the Getty Villa in the Antiquities Department. And welcome to Bacchus Uncorked, the Ancient Greek Drinking Party. I'm going to pause at the end of every sentence, so you do that. My colleagues and I, along with many people seen and unseen who make this event happen, are delighted to welcome you here to our latest Bacchus Uncorked. As many of you know, these wine programs explore art, wine, and culture in the ancient world and merge learning and wine, and today the focus is on ancient Greece. This event is generously supported by the Getty Villa Council, for which we are very grateful. Thank you. And I know a number of you here are regular attendees to our Bacchus Uncorked events. Do we have any first-timers? Welcome to you all. Welcome to you all. Now, it's my pleasure to welcome our speaker and our wine educator. Kathleen Lynch is a professor at the University of Cincinnati in the Department of Classics. In her research, she considers the social uses of Greek pottery, especially Athenian vessels, both at home in Athens and exported abroad. Her book, The Symposium in Context, Pottery from a Late Archaic House Near the Athenian Agora, won the Archaeological Institute of America Wiseman Book Award in 2013. Her ongoing study of pottery from the excavations of the Athenian Agora continues to advance the field, and she's also published on pottery from Troy and Gordion in Turkey and at Boyanket in Albania. Kathleen's publications on non-pottery subjects are also numerous, including a very recent article that redates the Temple of Hephaestus in Athens. Kathleen has visited us several times before, and in 2019, she held a Getty Residential Fellowship to examine Athenian pottery in the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Most recently, she's been a crucial participant in the development of the Picture Worlds exhibition, and if I can go off-piste from my text, I would just like to take this opportunity to publicly acknowledge Kathleen and thank her for all of her support. As we've developed the Picture Worlds exhibition, Kathleen is someone that I have looked up to for many years, not only for her research and her intellectual explorations, but also her geniality, collegiality, and her commitment to making Greek archaeology as accessible and as engaging to all. And it's been a real honor to work with her in developing the exhibition, and there could be no sort of finer way of concluding that and expressing that than inviting her back now that the exhibition is open for tonight's event. Turning to Diego Meraviglia is President and Director of Education of the North American Sommelier Association. In 2008, he obtained the Gold Pin certification with the Italian Sommelier Association and the Worldwide Sommelier Association. He is a certified master taster and a certified specialist of wine with the Society of Wine Educators in the United States. A native Italian, Diego is passionate about archaeology and ancient European history with a focus on his native land's Celtic heritage. And if you could all join me again in welcoming our speakers this evening, and I can hand over the podium to Kathleen.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be with you, and truly, just days ago, I was in the heat of Athens, so here I am with you, and I go back tomorrow, so. Yeah, thank you for coming out tonight. It sounds like a good crowd. So what we're going to talk about in my portion of the evening is I'm going to introduce this ancient Greek wine drinking party. And first of all, we're going to talk about its characteristics, how do we define it. Then we're going to take a field trip, and we're going to go in space and time back to ancient Athens and look at the contents of an ancient Greek house and see what the evidence for the symposium is at the household level. And then finally, I'll just warn you, finally we're going to end with some symposium math. Yeah, you'll be able to do it, I promise. Okay, well, thank you very much. So the symposium, before we even started, someone came up to me and said, this symposium thing, I thought it was like an academic conference. Well, now you're going to know. The symposium, the term symposium, comes from the ancient Greek words. Posius means to drink, and sum means together, to drink together. So already you know something about the ancient Greek wine drinking party. It was done as a group. It was done as a group. To drink by yourself was taboo. You didn't do your own drinking. You drank together with some friends. So when we look at the definition of the symposium, the key is the wine, that it's focused on wine drinking. Now, most cultures in the world and over time, they gather together as a group around food, including our own. Like Thanksgiving, we come together over Thanksgiving and it's about the food. There might be some wine, but it's incidental to the food. In the symposium, the wine is the focus. If you are hosting a symposium, you can feed your guests. You don't have to. We're going to see that sometimes you bring your own snacks. But even if you feed them, you take a pause, you wash the hands, you move the tables, and then the symposium starts. So it is really focused on wine drinking. It's held in the house of an individual at night, and the individual is inviting people into their home. We'll talk a little bit about the space of the symposium in just a minute. How often did these happen? Well, we don't really know, but we imagine that if for the wealthy men who were living in Athens, they probably went to a symposium a week or so. How often did you host one? We don't know, but maybe once a month, something like that. Now, again, I said you drink as a group, but you drink in a small group. And the idea was you wanted to limit the number of participants so that everyone could participate in the same conversation. Have you been to dinner parties where the table is so big you can only talk to the people to your right and your left? That is not what they wanted. So as we'll see, the seats are arranged so that everyone can look at each other and share in the activities. I say it's a small group of men. Well, with the exception that the women who were present were hired. They were hired entertainers, musicians, or entertainers of some sort, or sex workers. So when we look at this cup in just a minute, we're going to see some of the different roles for women in the symposium. But the homeowner's wife and his daughters were not present at the symposium. And in fact, the placement of the room where the symposium took place in a house was always right inside the front door, so that your male guests did not wander throughout your house. You didn't want them encountering the women of the house. Another quintessential characteristic of the symposium is that they mixed their wine with water. They cut their wine with water. And the ratio of wine or water was variable. So you could decide each night how strong you wanted your wine. And in Plato's Symposium, I know some of you have probably read Plato's Symposium. In Plato's Symposium, they're talking about how strong it should be, and they say, oh man, we were out late last night, so let's go easy tonight. So there's an example where we have people going to symposiums back to back, and one night after another. The ratios could go anywhere from 1 part wine to 3 parts water, or 2 parts wine to 3 parts water, or 1 part wine to 10 parts water. This act of mixing the wine and the water, cutting it, is a characteristic of the symposium that defines the Greeks as civilized, because they thought that anyone that drank their wine straight was a barbarian. Just keep that in mind as the night goes on. So that act of mixing was a self-definition for the Greeks. So what is the whole purpose of this wine drinking? It's to create bonds amongst the participants. This is why it's so critical that everyone is participating in the same conversation or doing his part within the evening. The idea is that the wine lowers your inhibitions and allows you to get to know each other in a new way. So that's critical. That's the point, the objective of the symposium. And now just one more time, this equal participation was important to the meaning of the symposium, but also the operation of the symposium. So sometimes when they came into the room, they set the ratio of wine and water, and then they would decide, what are we going to talk about tonight? And they'd come up with a topic on the spot, and then each man had to give a speech on that topic. You could not prepare ahead for this assignment, so you had to on the spot come up with a speech. Other times, as we'll see, there was singing, and one man would sing one verse and then hand it to the next guy, and he had to continue the song. So you showed your cultural knowledge by being able to participate like this. Finally, in terms of equal participation, they drank in rounds. So if you finished your cup first, you had to wait for everybody else to drink theirs, and then everyone got a refill at the same time. This was a way of keeping everybody at the same level of drunkenness as the night went on. As I said, the room right inside the front door, designated for the symposium, it's called the andron. And in Greek, that means the room of the men, the room of the men. And this is something funny for me. This is a very geeky joke. But in modern Greece, when you have restrooms, the women's room and the men's room, the name on the door of the men's room is andron. So I always imagine the men in there having a symposium instead of doing their business. So the andron, this cup gives us a view of what's happening in the andron, and so let's use it to get to know the characteristics of the symposium. So the first thing you see is that they drink while reclining on their right elbow. And they recline on a couch called a kline. And we have to imagine in our room, our andron, that the couches are arrayed around the outside of the room so everyone is looking in at each other and, as I said, can have a conversation together. Here you see one of the women, and you can see she's a sex worker here. She's nude, which is not something an upstanding woman would be shown as. So the women who are present are a kind of sex worker that was a cultivated woman, like a geisha, and the Greek term of it was hetaira, or companion. We also see here, over here, we see the mixing bowl. This crater is the mixing bowl into which wine and water is mixed. So it is the symbol of the civilized activity of the Greek symposium. So it becomes a sign for all that it stands for, the whole activity of the symposium. And then we see the cup that the man is drinking from. And this cup is called a kylix. And the Athenian potters, the Greek potters, not just Athenian, Greek potters made this cup specifically for use in the symposium. And you could drink milk out of it, you could drink water out of it, but the potter made it for wine drinking. And we happen to I have a visual aid tonight. If you go upstairs to the gallery, one of the wonderful things that they've done is they've created replicas. So you can pick these up upstairs and hold them. So this is an example of a kylix. And so imagine reclining on your elbow and drinking from this. So this broad bowl, wow, this is another thing that's ensuring that you're not getting too drunk, because if you got too drunk, it would slop all over you, and the evidence of your drunkenness would be visible. So this gives us a sense of how challenging that would be, and again, something that is a cultural definition that you'd have to know, you'd have to practice at that in order to be able to manage your drink. So the kylix is unique to the symposium, and it's in each individual gets one. Now let's take a closer look here. Here we have another female female present. She's the musician, the aulis, double aulis player. She's playing music, and then our fellow reclining with the kylix, he has his hand on his head with his head tilted back, and this is the gesture of singing. He's singing along with the music that she's playing. Now remember that gesture of your hand on your head, because that's going to come back later. I said you didn't have to feed your guests. They sometimes brought their own snacks. So this is a wicker basket. This is a picnic basket hanging on the wall behind this guy. And we're going to see another one of these later. Now, all of this rhetoric about moderation and we cut our wine, all of this is, we're protesting too much, because we know that sometimes they overindulged. And the cups give us some evidence of that. So unfortunately, this grouping over here, the man is the piece, the fragment is missing. But you notice this is a servant girl, and she holds her head away as he leans down and he vomits into this utility bowl. And I give you, this is a bowl called a lakane. This is a common household bowl for you could knead your dough in it or wash your baby, or in this case, collect the mess. And I think there's something that I think the painter is doing something very funny here, because he's juxtaposing the crater, the symbolic crater, with the lakane, what happens when you overindulge. We're going to see more evidence of this later. So this cup is really handy because it gives us some insight on what went on in the Andron during the symposium. We also know that they played games. So in addition to telling stories and singing songs, they also played games. And this one is called kottabos. So one of the things about ancient Greek wine is that it was thicker, it was unfiltered, so it left dregs, left lees in the bottom of the cup. And the Greeks do not let an opportunity pass. They made a game out of it. So the game was you took your kylix, as this person is, and you flung it around, and you let the lees go, and you tried to hit a target. And as you did it, you made a wish, and if you hit the target, your wish came through. Often these were love wishes, like, if I hit the target, so-and-so will pay attention to me. So this is, kottabos is another diversion during the symposium. After the symposium, sometimes they took it on the road. They went out into the streets. They took the party to the streets. So if you think about the Andron, people who are invited to the symposium are inside the household, they're inside the Andron. No one is seeing what's happening. So the public, other people don't know who has been invited to the symposium that night. Well, after they've done their drinking, sometimes, not always, they would take it out into a parade on the street. So they'd continue their singing and their dancing, and that's when they would call attention to themselves. That's how other people would say, oh, Yorgos is attending the symposium tonight, as a way of getting cultural capital from it. This cup, you can see this man, he has a wreath on, and he has his coat over, but he has a different kind of cup. This is called a skiphos, and I think this was the ancient to-go cup. This was the red Solo cup. And because you can see it's a different shape, the kylix is designed to test your skills while you're reclining. This is a much more functional cup. Okay, so with that background about the symposium, let's take a field trip. Let's take a field trip in space and time and go back to ancient Athens around 500 BC. And we're going to look at some actual archaeological evidence from an individual's house. So the material that I'm going to be talking about comes from the excavations of the Athenian agora, the ancient agora, which are done by the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. They've been excavating this area since 1931. And the center, the agora itself, is the ancient marketplace, but it's also the civic center of ancient Athens. It is the birthplace of democracy. So as you can expect, there's some public buildings that are the bureaucratic buildings for democracy, and then there's an open space where the marketplace would take place, and then you're looking at this restored building, this restored Stoa building. This is a building that dates later than the house that we're going to talk about. It's a Hellenistic building. But enough of it survived into the 20th century that they could reconstruct it. And it now houses on the first floor, on the ground floor, it houses the Museum of the Ancient Agora. So all of the artifacts that were found are on display there, not all of them, but choice ones. And then in the second story, on the second floor, that's where the excavation offices are. So last week this time, I was toiling away in a room right there, and it's on the second floor, and it is the only room left in the Stoa which does not have air conditioning. So I'm just saying that blocks, old block buildings, boy, they really heat up when the sun strikes them. Anyway, so we have to imagine that this is the marketplace, the central square of ancient Athens. But the Agora excavations have excavated beyond that central square, so they found houses that line or circle around that downtown center. This would be a great place to live if you were a businessman or you had something to sell at the Agora. So it's not a surprise to find these houses arrayed around the Agora. Well, one of those houses was the focus of the book that you just heard about, the Symposium in Context, because the house contained a set of symposium cups, which allows us to take a closer look at a very intimate household level about the importance of the symposium to a real ancient Greek family. So I know you guys are here tonight because you are wine enthusiasts, but take a look at this chart. This house, this ancient house, half of its dishes, its cups, even its cookingware, half of it was for wine drinking. So imagine if you opened your cupboards at home and over half of them were filled with wine glasses. And then over here is like, oh, there's a couple pots and pans and a cereal bowl. That's it. But you can see what you're putting priority on, all your different wine glasses. So that's what you're seeing here. So the pottery that's associated with the symposium, with wine drinking, is here. The tableware, there were some things that were for oil or other condiments, but fascinating to me, and this is something I've worked more on, is that this house did not have plates and bowls. They did not have an equivalent complex set for dining. They didn't. They had this very articulated set of drinking ware, but they did not have the same for dining. And then you have the cooking. As I said, they did have some cooking jugs, as well as that lacane, that household utility bowl, that's in this yellow section here. The miscellaneous includes some perfume jars and some little trinket boxes. So let's look at the cups that this family owned. So this set has 6 red figure cups. There are 2 techniques of decorating ancient Greek pottery, black figure and red figure. And this household, interestingly, was at a time when both black figure and red figure were being used, and we'll see that they combined it in this symposium set. So let's take a look at these cups just quickly. On your upper left is our guy with his to-go cup. We just saw him in bigger form a few minutes ago. This one in the middle of the upper row is different because it's slightly smaller and it has decoration on the outside and the inside. The other 5 are only decorated on the interior. Remember I said that it was a dark wine, so as you drained it, that picture would appear as you drained your wine. So this middle one is a smaller capacity. Capacity is going to be important to us when we do our math, our symposium math. And some scholars have theorized that it is for the young man of the house, the son of the house, so that he can participate in the symposium before he's a man, so he can attend, but not fully. I'm not sure, but it certainly stands out because it is smaller. It stands out from the other ones, which are very consistent in size. Up here on the upper right, we have a guy who's treading grapes. He's making the wine that you're drinking, treading grapes. And he has an inscription around his head, or arcs over his head, and it says, Pros agareo, I welcome you. And it's not clear whether it's the boy, or the cup, or the wine, or the host, but the first person makes it very active and animates this cup. And then down, going here clockwise, down here we have a boy who has a garment on that signifies that he is a slave, a servant, and he is running, that's what his feet gestured like this, he's running, with strips of meat. So these are either for that pre-symposium meal, which you weren't required to do, or maybe for snacks, for snacks while the men are drinking. The center has this really stunning owl looking out. Imagine draining your cup and then pop, that owl pops right out at you, staring at you. And by this time, the owl had become the symbol of the Athenian state. It was the symbol of the city. And I think this owl, this cup, is making a joke because he has an inscription that goes around his head, and it translates to, "I am one kous." And a kous was 3.2 liters. So I think he's saying, my wine is as powerful as drinking a whole kous of wine. And it's a joke about the potency of the wine. Even though you've watered it down, it's going to have a kick to it. And then finally, this last one over here with the wheel, let's look at it in bigger detail. This is very odd. There are no parallels for this. It's a wagon wheel in the center of the cup. And I think that this is another joke about drinking, because the more you would drink, if you go into a little too far, that wheel would start to spin, sort of like bed spins. And so it's a joke about getting drunk too fast, or drinking wine too fast. So we learned something about this household. Let's just go back 1 second. There is no mythology here. There is no mythology here. So this, in an Athenian house, and this is not atypical, other evidence from Athenian houses, Athenians themselves did not have mythology on their Sympotic cups. Instead, the images reflect the act of drinking and the conviviality, the joviality, having a good time. It's the host wanted to make sure his guests were having a good time. So with that in mind, let's do some symposium math. And talk about this watered down wine and figure out exactly how much of this did they drink. So if we go back to our set of kylixes from this house, as these are the red figure ones, it also owned 9 plain black ones in exactly the same size. So if you remember what I said, equality is important in the symposium. So not only are you drinking in rounds, everyone has a cup of the same size. Imagine if you let people bring their own cup, somebody would bring a big gulp cup, and somebody else would have little tiny cups. So this way it ensures that everyone is drinking the same amount at the same time. The plain black ones were probably so that the homeowner could vary the number of guests. Some nights it's only going to be these 5 people. Other nights he'll have a larger group and he'll be able to add those plain black ones so everyone gets a cup of the same size. Okay, so we determined the capacity of these cups, and we filled, the question is, how full do you, in determining the capacity, how full do you make it? And we knew it couldn't be filled all the way to the rim, so we found, we decided a kind of compromise of 1.5 centimeters below the rim. Like if you filled it up to 1.5 centimeters below the rim, which is just at handle level. Because remember, the room it's at night, it's dark, the person who's filling these, there's not much light, so eyeballing it up to the handles would be a realistic thing. So if you do that, it's 355, the average is 355 milliliters. And to give you an idea, that's the size of a Coke can. This is how much these kylixes held. Now, the kylix that I just showed you is much larger. Kylixes come in different sizes, and we're talking here about Athens. This is the regular size for real Athenian symposia. This is the typical size. These bigger cups are for display or for dedication, so we do see them in larger sizes, as you'll see upstairs or in the galleries down here, but let's focus on the ones that were used by real Athenians. This is one of the aspects of my research, is I wanted to hone in on actual archaeologial evidence. Okay, so each cup holds about a Diet Coke can of mixed wine and water. This house owned an oinakwe. So as I said, this is a time when we have this mixture of red figure and black figure, which is really interesting. And this is the only piece with a mythological scene on it, and it has Heracles and the Cretan bull. The oinakawe would be dipped into the crater. The crater has the mixture of wine and water. You dip the oinakawe in there, and then you pour into the individual kylixes. A servant would be doing this. The capacity of this oinakawe to right around the bottom of the neck is 1.5 liters. So this means that this oinakawe can fill up our 5 cups one time. Isn't that cool? That's really kind of neat. All right. Confession. I told you that the most important piece for the whole symposium was the crater because it symbolized the civility of mixing wine and water. This house did not have a crater, and this is really troublesome because it's got these cups. You don't use these Kylix cups for anything else. This is like having a printer, and you know there's a computer somewhere because you can't use a printer without a computer. I think I have 2 theories about this. One is that the crater was kept in use long after these guys were thrown away because it's the largest and the most expensive piece, so they would want to extend its life. Or perhaps this family owned a metal crater, and they were mixing not just black figure and red figure, but ceramic and metal within the same context of the symposium. Either way, we know that they had a crater because you cannot have kylixes without a crater. So in order to continue our math assignment, I found another crater from the Agora excavations, and I'm using it to continue our math exercise. So this crater is very large, but you'll see similar ones here in the collection. It's 0.5 meter tall and almost as big, round, and its capacity is 34 liters. 17 2-liter soda bottles. So when they say, oh, we're drinking our wine mixed with water, you have to realize they're drinking an awful lot of this wine mixed with water. So if we continue with our math, our oinakawe can be filled 22 times from this crater, which means 95 servings of wine, or 19 servings for each of our 5 symposias. Now, if there were more than 5, if we filled out the set with the black glaze, the numbers would go down. But what this is saying is that even though they're cutting that wine with water, they're still drinking a lot of it. And the goal was to keep you at that tipsy level to lower your inhibitions without going over into drunkenness. But as I said, we know they went over into drunkenness because we saw the guy on the kylix. And then I want to share with you one other shape, one other piece of pottery from this house from ancient Athens. And this is a kind of amphora, a special kind of amphora called a pelike, and that just refers to the fact that it's baggy. But this is the shape, the form you would bring the wine into the room in this vessel. And it has pictures on both sides. I'm going to show you both sides. So on this side, we have an adult male, and we can tell it's an adult male because he has a beard. That was the signal, iconographic signal for an adult. And he's, oh shoot, I ruined it. No, you didn't see it, you didn't see it. I hit the space bar. He's got these little booties on, so he's traveling somewhere, and he has a lyre, and tied to the lyre is our picnic basket. So he's bringing his own snacks, and he's strumming his lyre. You see he's strumming it, and his mouth is open, and coming out of his mouth is an inscription. It says Icky, so it's like la 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 la. He's singing along. So he's probably on his way to a symposium. On the other side, we have a young man whom we hope is going home from the symposium because he has no beard, so this signals that he's younger than the guy on the other side. He leans heavily on his walking stick. He also has little booties, and he holds his head, and you notice that position, that's the singing position. Only he's dipped down, and he's using his other fingers to force himself to vomit. And the painter has, there's an added red stream of vomit coming down here. And, and to continue the joke about singing, there's an inscription coming down from his elbow that says, "Ay, oi," sort of a grunt, the grunt of agony that he's experiencing. But this is certainly a joke about singing, and the guy on the other side is singing a nice tune compared to this fellow. So looking at the pottery from this one house, we get a lot of insight into our homeowner who has selected pottery that really is funny, it's humorous, it's not mythological, it reflects on the act of drinking and a good time, a nice time with a small group of friends. So as I close things out, as I bring things together, let me just go over a couple points that take-home points about the symposium. We want to remember that this mixing of wine and water is what signifies being civilized. And this is important to the Greeks, this idea of being civilized. But we know, let's say civilized with an asterisk, because we know they drank an awful lot of this mixed wine and water, and so they still got drunk, even though it's mixed. We know that the wine is essential. There's a reason why this is not focused on food. It's the effect of wine, lowering inhibitions. Tonight you'll be seated at a table with new friends, some old friends, and the wine will allow you to relax and get to know each other. You're going to have a symposium in just a minute, but ladies, we're going to be there, so it's not an official Greek symposium. But the goal was to break down these barriers in order to form relationships that would carry over into politics, business, or even marriage relationships. This lowering the inhibition allowed it to form bonds. And I have, in some of my research, I've made the point that it's not a surprise that Athens, where they invented democracy, the symposium is used to help men who formerly had no vote, to get them to understand the role of democracy by meeting other people, meeting other men, and listening about politics. So the symposium is a great tool for the democracy as well. And that food takes a back seat. This is really weird. So the Greeks are odd. Every other culture focuses on food. They may be drinking alcoholic beverages at the same time, but the food is the focus. And that's because food is related to the confidence of the food supply and sustenance, being able to sustain your people. And in food-related feasts, there's often a dependency. You have been invited, and I, the host, am showing off that I can provide this fancy food for you. And it creates a hierarchy, the host and the guests are indebted to the host. That is not the case with the symposium. Everyone is equal. Even the host, he just blends in with the rest of his guests. He doesn't have any status higher than his guests. They decide together what the topic is going to be. They decide together about the strength of the wine each evening. So you can see the democratic principles here of equality. And everybody drinks at the same rate. So the symposium, now the next time some of you get invited to an academic conference, I hope you'll say, "Where's the wine?" Is there going to be wine here? Because wouldn't these academic conferences be better with wine? The number that I've gone to. So thank you very much. I look forward to drinking like a barbarian with you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Getty. If it's not your first time, if it is, you're in for a treat and a wonderful evening without flicking any wine sediment around, that's for sure. So my name's Diego Meraviglia. I'm from northwestern Italy. I've been in LA for 20 years, but I'm originally from the region of Piemonte. And to the wonderful joy of my wife, I have solo symposiums at my house every single evening. So I relate to a lot of the things that Professor Lynch said in her presentation, splendid presentation. Moreover, I am absolutely and proudly a barbarian, because I do not mix my wine with water or anything else. But back in the day, they would have. And I think that from a wine perspective, a very consistent subject that keeps being assessed by scholars and sommeliers and wine experts and the industry in general is, how can we know or truly get close to what the wines were that were being produced and enjoyed back then in 2,000 and more, 4,000 years ago, up to 6,000 years ago? We really can't. We have theories, there's some archaeological evidence, but we really can't know exactly what wines tasted like, although we can get very close and guesstimate. Now, one of the reasons why the ancient Greeks were watering down their wine, and that followed on, as we shall see, with the Romans later on, is because back in those days there wouldn't have been any notion of alcoholic fermentation. They didn't know that there was the existence of any yeast microorganism fermenting sugar and transforming it into ethyl alcohol, so they wouldn't have had the scientific knowledge of that. Hence, the wines would have almost certainly always fermented all the way to the end. Today, we lower temperatures, we filter the wines, we stop the fermentation when we want to, and so on and so forth. There's a better scientific understanding. So wines would have reached the point to when yeast dies, which is about 17 to 18% alcohol. 18% alcohol, it's a lot of alcohol for a wine. So it's pretty understandable why they would have started diluting the wine down. The Romans later than the Greeks also started conching their wine in the sense of adding spices or seawater or fish sauce even, like garum, which was the name of an ancient fish sauce if they wanted kind of like a sea-like flavor. So they would flavor their wines, they would cook them, and so on and so forth. So it's difficult for us to really know what the wines were like, but we can get close. And we can definitely take a trip, which we will this evening, a trip geographically at least, and even with the grape varietals, throughout the Greek influences in Europe, and even prior to that, where wine would have originated from and arrived to the Greeks, who were historically in the wine world the true scholars of winemaking and grape growing throughout Europe. Wine is older than the ancient Greeks, but it was the ancient Greeks who truly spread the philosophy of wine, the sort of ideology behind wine, the symposium, this concept of the wine being a lubricant for the mind and also a medicine for the soul. So the philosophy behind wine and the enjoyment of wine would definitely have been spread by the Greeks, who were intense inspiration for the subsequent Romans. The Romans took the inspiration from the Greeks, they developed winemaking to a more technical level and a more commercial level, and then obviously with the expansion of the Roman Empire that we shall see later, wine was then spread, the wine and the vine was then spread around all of Europe. But the Greeks were the original scholars. They set the basis. They inspired the Romans, who then took wine and expanded it. But the Greeks, before the growth of the Romans and the expansion of the Romans, the Greeks already had contacts, and we have archaeological proof of this, with certain populations prior to Roman expansion. The Etruscans, for instance, and the Samnites. The Etruscans are the ones that gave the name to Tuscany in Italy, and the Samnites were the main population living in the present-day region of Campania in Italy. So think the Amalfi Coast and Naples and so on and so forth, which are very important areas for grape growing and winemaking with a lot of history. So we know that even prior to the Romans, the Greeks were already communicating their knowledge of wine to other populations that then got encompassed into the Roman Empire, and wine started to evolve all the way till today. So the Greeks were the precursors. They were definitely the scholars of the culture of wine, the philosophy of wine, but also viticultural concepts in the sense of grape growing, certain techniques, certain ways to train the vine, pruning, and even winemaking techniques. We shall see that there's proof in ancient writings of the Greeks utilizing certain winemaking techniques to kind of fix the wine, alter the flavor, and adjust, things that we do very commonly today in almost all the wineries on earth. So we go from the culture and the philosophy of Dionysus, Greece, to the culture and the philosophy of Bacchus in Roman times. Now, at the core of the spirituality of wine that was always present throughout the ancient world We have the concept of the lubricant for the mind in the symposium, but we also have the concept of the medicine for the soul. And a beautiful word that comes from Greek origin is nepenthe, which is the concept that wine is defined as a medicine for sorrow. So a place, person, or a thing, but in the case of wine especially, an aid in forgetting your pain and suffering. I love forgetting my pain and suffering every single evening. So if we look at the Greek civilization, and we look at the Greece and its colonies in 550 BC, we notice that it extends from Greece across the sea, very close, very, very near, to the southern Italy, all the way to coastal France and coastal Spain. And we see certain factors in the vineyards and the traditions of winemaking and grape growing in these areas that are common. There's a common thread, especially in the vineyards and in the varietals, and we shall see later on. But also, they expanded further east into the eastern edges of the Black Sea, between the Black Sea and what would be a little further to the right outside the map, the Caspian Sea. And this area is extremely important because that area there has been proven, it was a theory, but it has been proven very recently, is the origin, the likely origin of Vitis vinifera. So we shall see a little later how the vine comes from this area and traveled through various populations to the Greeks, who developed its spirituality and philosophy, inspired the tribes of Italy, and especially the Romans, and then from there we have modern-day wine. So if we look at southern Italy, first of all, there are a lot of Greek archaeological sites and temples in southern Italy, especially in the two regions of Calabria and the island of Sicily, which are the two most important southern Italian regions of ancient Greek inspiration. Cities like Neapolis, which is Napoli, so Neapolis, the new city, was considered Greece's second capital back in the day, and it was founded by the Greeks. Sybaris, like Sibari, Crotos, Crotone in Calabria, Siracusa, so Syracuse in Sicily, and Barion, which is Bari in Puglia. So these were cities founded by the Greeks, and the Greeks would bring their philosophy of wine, would bring their vineyards, would bring their wine production there. Some of you may know, if you've been to previous editions of Bacchus on Cork, some of you may not know, but at the Olympics in ancient Greece, the official wine, we have archaeological proof, the official wine that was being served was Ciro, which is the flagship wine of the southern Italian region of Calabria. So the Greeks would go outside of ancient Greece, plant the vineyards, develop the winemaking, and then re-import their foreign produced wine, calling Italy Enotria, the land of wine, because of the quality of the crops, the quality of the grapes, and the quality of the wines that were being produced there. The Romans absorbed this, and they extensively worked upon developing and evolving the teachings of the ancient Greeks in spirituality, in philosophy, in consumption techniques and mannerisms, but also in production. And they then developed it on a more commercial scale. One of the most important pieces of evidence of ancient Greek influence in southern Italy and across Europe, and this evidence, especially the vineyards, we find, if we go back to this map, all throughout southern France, all throughout eastern Spain, and very heavily in the southern Italian regions. And this is a vine trading method called goblet, in English, alberello in Italian, and this is of definite ancient Greek inspiration. This is how the Greeks would have been growing their grapes. This is exactly how they would have been training the vines. The use of amphora, also extremely important. We don't see the use of oak in wine until way later, when the Roman expansion with the Gallic Wars, Julius Caesar, expanding to the further northern territories where wood was the main raw material available, and the Celtic tribes in that area, northern Italy and France, would have started using wooden containers to store their wine and to age their wine. Pliny the Elder, for instance, a very famous ancient Roman historian and writer on wine, talked about how the Gallic tribes of northern Italy had these containers of wood the size of houses to store their wine in. And that is really important. Think about how much that changed the profile of wine through the decades following. We're used to drinking red wine today that has this vanilla, this oaky tone, these kind of spicy notes, cinnamon, etc., that come from oak aging. It wouldn't have been the case back then because clay and amphora would have been the main vessel utilized. The Greeks also would line their amphora in certain situations, certain productions, would line the inside of their amphoras with the Aleppo pine resin, creating, retsina, which was the world's most ancient flavored wine. The Romans then would copy that in other ways following. But even more important is the main four categories of wine that the ancient Greeks established. So the ancient Greeks were the first ones to actually isolate and establish the four main categories of wine that we still enjoy today. So with the exception of bubbly wine, right, which came way later, the whites, the rosés, and especially the reds were of basic ancient Greek creation. We have evidence of this in an archaeological site on the island of Crete, where we find the most ancient wine press that we have discovered, specifically utilized to torque or press the skins of the red grapes, extracting the color. So we have evidence to believe that the ancient Greeks were the first population to truly and purposely produce dark red wines. Not only, but Pliny the Elder tells us that they were also advanced winemakers, utilizing chalk, putting chalk inside the wine that would then filter through and fall to the bottom to reduce the acidity of a wine. If a wine was too sour, the grapes were too sour, it wasn't picked right, they would be able to lower the acidity with the utilization of chalk. And we see this evolution of the amphora from the ancient Greek ones through the prime Italic versions of the amphora, arriving at the main ancient Roman amphoras, which are called the Dressels, named after Henry Dressel, who was an archaeologist specialized on ancient amphoras. So we see this influence of the ancient Greeks going into the Roman territories and inspiring the Romans who then expanded. The varietals, too, very, very important. We can probably safely say that a good amount of European grapes, which are the origin of the grapes of most of the world, especially the New World, would have migrated from ancient Greece into southern Italy. And we have a lot of evidence of this, especially in Calabria and in Sicily, where the vast majority of the varietals are of ancient Greek origin. Let's not forget that this part of Italy used to be called Megale Hellas. So it was the Greater Greece. Megale Hellas standing for Greater Greece. In Italian, we'd call it Magna Grecia. So we know that it was a Greek colony where grapes would migrate through into the Italian peninsula. Grapes like Aglianico, for instance, which is one of the most famous southern Italian red varietals. Gaglioppo from Calabria, the flagship grape of Calabria that's utilized to make the Cirò wine, a wine of the ancient Olympics. Negro Amaro in Puglia. Malvasia, very, very famous perfumey aromatic grape from Italy that we find also in Portugal and in Spain, would have originated from the Greeks and their expansion into the southern Italian territories. And also, that's pretty easy to tell, a varietal called Greco, which is the most important grape of Calabria. Not just the grapes, but in the ancient world, we even see certain Greek exports, ancient Greek exports of wine, specific wine names that would have become famous in the colonies and then subsequently exotic and very sought after in Roman times. We find the Con, for instance, the salty wine of the Kos Island, the Lemno from the Limnio grape, considered to be one of the most ancient and unique varietals mentioned by Aristotle. And then last but not least, the Chian, right? The black wine of Chios, dark, pressed, the skins, the extraction of color. So these were very important wine names, right? Imagine like saying, Napa Valley Cabernet or a Champagne or a Bordeaux. So they would have been important wine brands that the Greeks would have exported out into the other territories. Now, at the height of the Roman Empire, the Romans took all that knowledge, encompassed the Etruscans and the Samnites, and expanded the vine all the way around the Mediterranean basin. So at the height of the Roman Empire, wine would have then been carried through across the Alps and expanded into all of the Mediterranean. Let's not forget that prior to Roman expansion, and hence without the influence of the Greeks into southern Italy, we would not have wine in all these areas. It was the Romans who planted the vines, especially in France. Across the Alps, they wouldn't have had any wine. So, love the French. If there's any French in the room, I apologize, but French wine is an Italian export. If you go back far enough, right? So we see how the Vitis vinifera is known and believed to originate in the Caucasus. This was a theory that was pretty accredited, but until recent times, we actually discovered archaeological evidence in Armenia, where the most ancient winery in the world was discovered, 6,000-year-old winery in the Areni cave in Armenia. So we know that that area was a very ancient starting place for the making of wine through Vitis vinifera grapes. Moving on to the Phoenicians, who then passed it on to the Greeks, and then the Greeks into Italy with the Romans, and expanding into the rest of Europe. So without further ado, as Socrates said, so far as drinking is concerned, you have my hearty approval. For wine does of a truth moisten the soul and lull our griefs to sleep. And with small cups, or large, we shall be brought by its gentle persuasion to a more sportive mood. Please enjoy the rest of your evening and the wines, ladies and gentlemen.